Hello, everybody. It's a Lizzy Albright fest going on here.
Oh, oh, that's
Barley's got to
Aw,
come in and say hello. Are you saying hello, Barley boy? That's
those
my.
are
Oh, look at that!
kind.
It's a puppy fest too. So, how are you today, Miss Cat?
I am well. How are you, my friend?
I'm I'm fine. I wasn't expecting Barley to be coming over here and climbing in my lap, but I'm glad he did because he's given me some love. So,
That's right.
so we're headed into chapter 7, and I will say, of course, I'll keep think. I think I keep saying this. I really love this chapter. I really love this chapter. I love the beginning of this book, and when I talk about the whole beginning, I talk about how that we're just setting a stage. We're giving an era. We're reliving the 60s, and we get to know Granny's mansion and all of these things. It sets up a story. At least it sets up Lizzie's background to a story. And as we go into this chapter, I'm thinking about the days right now that where I don't know when you're watching this, people, but if you're watching it while it's coming out, this is the days when we're all being sequestered and stuck at home because of the COVID virus, and it's dark days. It's the darkest days I've ever known, and I can only imagine that this is very similar to what it would have been like to go through the Great Depression.
I'm most certain. Been talking to my mom about it, in fact, and what they did to, to I don't want to say the word survive because we aren't quite that severe yet, but the sequestering and the, watching of the food supplies and things like that, and all of that is new to my generation as well.
And of course, just
And
the fact that businesses are struggling, I certainly feel the impact of that in my own world. And the interesting thing is that this chapter is going to relate to that a little bit. I hope that everybody enjoys it, and then we will come back and chat more about it right after we listen. So take a listen. Chapter 7. Lizzie, are you up here? It was Granny. I'm up here in the attic with McDo. Granny and Mrs. Albright climbed the stairs and opened the attic door. May we join you? Granny asked. Oh, yes, perfect timing. You can help. I was just about to reenact the story of Little Red Riding Hood because McDougal is the perfect big bad wolf. Now that you're here, it's even better. Granny, you can be Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother, and Mom, you can be the woodsman who comes to save the day. Well, now, that is perfect, isn't it? Said Granny. And do you know what? What? Asked Lizzie. I just happen to have a red cloak in the cedar closet. No, you don't. Seriously? I certainly do. I've never seen it, Lizzie said, thinking about the birthday wish. It's in there. I keep it in a garment bag. I'm sure it's just been hiding out of sight. Let me see if I can find it. Surely it's back there somewhere. Granny rifled through the racks in the back of the closet. Why, here it is. She passed the garment bag to Lizzie, who laid it on the old divan. Lizzie tried to open the bag, but the zipper was stuck. Mrs. Albright fiddled with the pull, and it finally released. Lizzie unzipped the bag and pulled out the cloak. Wow, it's beautiful. Was this yours? It certainly was, admitted Granny. I wore it when I was about your age. I loved it so much that I saved it. Go ahead, try it on. It's perfect, said Lizzie. And now it's yours, said Granny. It's your birthday present. A little bird told me that you were wishing for a red cloak. It's perfect, said Lizzie. Mrs. Albright wrapped the cloak around Lizzie's shoulders, and Granny fastened the clasp at the collar. Lizzie stood in front of the dressing mirror. She twirled this way and that way, watching the cloak flare out and spin. She imagined herself trotting through the forest on an adventure. She glanced down at McDougal, who was sniffing at the hem of the cloak. Are you a big bad wolf, McDou? You first have to find me in the woods. She reached down and scratched McDougal behind his ears. Lizzie acted out an abbreviated version of the story, and Granny and her mother played along. Near the end, She realized that McDougal was going to have to eat Granny, so she made up a different ending in which the big bad wolf learned a valuable lesson and became the big good wolf. She finished her play as she always did by saying, "And they all lived happily ever after." Everyone laughed and applauded wildly. McDougal jumped around with excitement. "Would you like to look through the cedar chest tonight?" Granny asked. "There's still plenty of time before lights out." "Mom, is it okay?" "I think it's a great idea," said Mrs. Albright. "I bet there are many things in this old chest that I haven't seen in a very long time." Mrs. Albright looked at Granny and winked. Granny winked back. Lizzy was starting to sweat, so she took the cloak off and hung it on a hat rack that was nearby. Granny took the key from her dress pocket and unlocked the chest. The creaky top opened, and the familiar smell of cedar permeated the room. Lizzy reached for the jewelry box first. There were so many rings, necklaces, pendants, and bracelets that Lizzy always imagined it to be a pirate's treasure chest. She picked up a shiny brooch. "Do you know about this brooch? Your grandfather gave it to me," said Granny. "Do you remember his name?" "Nathaniel Edward Winters," said Lizzy, proudly articulating each name. "Winner, winner, chicken dinner," Granny said, and they all laughed. Mrs. Albright took the brooch and held it in her palm. "I remember this. Dad found 3 perfect rubies and had a jeweler make it for you. The stones represented the 3 of us kids." "That's exactly right. You, Dawn, and Ellen were his pride and joy. To him, you were all perfect." She didn't bring up that he had had it made just after he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It was the last gift he gave her before he died. This was not a night for feeling sad, so Granny picked up another piece of jewelry and changed the topic. "Have you seen this one, Lizzy?" "I'm not sure, but it's really pretty. I like the heart." "It's a claddagh ring from Ireland. The claddagh symbol is 2 hands clasping a heart, and the heart is wearing a crown. The hands are for friendship, the heart is for love, and the crown is for loyalty." "That's really neat. I love it," said Lizzy. Even though it was too big for her tiny fingers, she slid it onto her thumb to admire it. "When did you go to Ireland?" "Oh, I've never been there, but my sister, Catherine, has visited Ireland many times. She gave me this ring for my birthday several years ago." They looked at more jewelry, sifted through yellowing papers, and flipped through the pages of the old family photo album. There were baby shoes that had been dipped in bronze, and military medals that had been awarded to Malcolm McHale for his service as a general in the Civil War. Granny and Mrs. Albright provided commentary on the items, and Lizzy tried to absorb as much as she could. She tried to imagine what it would be like to go back to the times when all these things were new. Granny lifted out the top tray from the cedar chest and set it aside. They began rummaging through the contents in the main part of the chest. There were a couple of christening gowns that had been worn by Granny and her sister. There were 2 very old dolls that were dressed in petticoats and bloomers. "These are great-grandmother's dolls, right?" asked Lizzy. Granny smiled. "Indeed they are." "You don't need to remind me again," said Lizzy. "I know these are not to be played with." "True, and it's unfortunate, but sometimes things get so old and so fragile that we just have to treasure, protect, and preserve them. I feel lucky to still have these." Lizzy didn't play with dolls very much, but she really loved these old heirloom dolls. She secretly promised to treasure, protect, and preserve them, just like Granny said. "Well, that's it," said Lizzy, looking at the empty chest. "I don't remember making it all the way to the bottom before." She gazed in amazement at the empty chest and ran her hand along the finely finished cedar interior. "Hey, what's that?" She turned to Granny with a questioning look on her face. "What? Did we forget something?" asked Granny. "No, that!" exclaimed Lizzy, pointing to a brass hole in the bottom near the front side of the chest. Said Mrs. Albright. "It looks like a keyhole to me. What do you think, Granny? Does it look like a keyhole to you?" Maggie winked at her mother again. I do believe it does, Granny concurred. I wonder if there's a key. Granny winked back. What about trying the same key? Suggested Lizzy. Good idea, said Mrs. Albright. Granny handed the key to Lizzy. She put the key in the keyhole and turned it. She heard a series of clicks, and suddenly the decorative wooden skirt on the front of the chest popped open. Oh my, are you serious? A secret compartment? She had read about these in her Nancy Drew books, but now here she was, staring at a real hidden drawer. Her heart raced with excitement, and butterflies fluttered in her stomach. She was both excited and petrified at the same time. Go ahead, open it, said Mrs. Albright. Lizzy took a deep breath and carefully pulled open the drawer. Her face slowly transitioned from showing anxious anticipation to that of bewilderment and dismay. She was expecting, well, she didn't know what she was expecting, but she wasn't expecting this. A pillow? Queried Lizzy. Why would a pillow be hiding in a secret drawer? Granny urged Lizzy to take it out of the drawer and have a closer look, which Lizzy did. She flipped the pillow to one side and then to the other. Then she looked inside the pillowcase. This doesn't look like a pillow, she thought out loud. She recognized the patchwork of fabrics and stitching. It's a quilt, Lizzy said, solving the mystery. Granny pulled the quilt from the pillowcase. She and Mrs. Albright began opening it up. The more they unfolded it, the bigger Lizzy's eyes got. Once it was fully open, they spread it out over the old divan, and it spilled onto the floor. Lizzy was amazed. It's huge and beautiful. I've never seen anything like it. Indeed, Lizzy was happy to see the quilt, but she was puzzled as to why it was kept in a secret place. After all, it was just a quilt. She surveyed the quilt and noticed all the different fabrics. There were plaids and checkerboards and dots. One fabric had maraschino cherries on it, which made her think of the cherry that Doug stole from her banana split earlier that afternoon. Another design had little starbursts splashed around on a dotted background. A fabric with small tilted squares reminded her of Alan's pajamas. She giggled when she found the singing roosters and shrieked with delight when she saw the fabric with the Scottish Terrier puppies. The puppies were frolicking around on boxes that had stars painted on their sides. MacDoo, you're in the quilt! McDougal looked at Lizzy, wagged his tail, and gruffed. Where did you get the quilt? Lizzy asked. I made it many years ago. Granny went on to explain that she had started making the quilt blocks because she was worried. It helped take her mind off her troubles. Why were you worried? Asked Lizzy. It was a bad time for everyone, not just for me. The country's money system failed and caused the Great Depression. It started in 1929. She explained that the hardships resulting from that financial disaster lasted a very long time, and many wealthy businessmen lost everything they had. Businesses that for years had been successful crumbled and failed. Granny emphasized that the McHale family had not escaped the crisis. They, too, had suffered tremendous financial loss, but luckily, her father had managed to survive the ordeal without losing everything. It took him years to recover, and even so, the McHale fortune never amounted to what it was before the Great Depression. Granny also told Lizzy about how prices skyrocketed and people couldn't afford the most basic necessities. The government gave out rations for eggs, sugar, butter, meat, fish, and cheese. Rationing helped to make sure that those who most needed these things got what they needed, but it almost never seemed to be enough. So you see, Lizzy, in many ways, this quilt tells that story. What do you mean? Asked Lizzy. During that time, one of the things people needed most was quilts to keep them warm. They couldn't afford just to go out and buy blankets, and they couldn't even afford to purchase fabric to make a quilt. They had to use what they had on hand. In those days, sacks for seeds, flour, and sugar were made out of cloth. Times got so bad that when the sacks were empty, they were washed, and mothers would use the cloth to make clothes for their children. Some companies started printing pretty designs on the sacks, so at least the kids' clothes looked a bit more cheerful. The leftover scraps were used to make quilts. "That sounds horrible," sighed Lizzy. "It's so sad." It was a sad time for sure, and it was during this worrisome period that I spent most of my time making these quilt blocks. I used pieces of fabric that I found at home. This one was from a dress I once wore. She pointed to a colorful fabric with nesting circles. Making this quilt kept my mind off our troubles and gave me something to do. I made many different blocks, and I learned all their names. "They have names?" asked Lizzy. "Of course they do. Remember the quilt I made for you? It's called Rail Fence. It's an easy block to make. There's a rail fence block in this quilt. Can you find it?" Lizzy scanned the quilt. There was so much to look at. "There!" Lizzy pointed to the familiar design. "That's it." "It sure is," Granny confirmed. Then she pointed to a different block. "This one is a Dresden Plate. Back in those days, a set of Dresden china was the envy of every bride. But when times got bad, it was much harder to afford a set of china, let alone expensive Dresden china, so it became popular to make quilts with this design. Look at the wedges coming out from the center. Can you see how the block resembles a fancy dinner plate?" Lizzy nodded when she saw the similarities. Since each wedge is a different fabric, making the quilt used up a lot of scraps. Dresden plate quilts were often given as bridal gifts. "I never knew quilts had stories. Can you help me make a Dresden plate quilt sometime?" Lizzy asked. "Well, of course I can, and your mother can join us." "That would be wonderful, a family affair," Mrs. Albright beamed. "What's this block called?" Lizzy said, pointing to a block with jagged triangles. "That's a bear's paw block. The points of the triangles are his claws." "Oh," said Lizzy, "that would be a scary quilt to sleep under. Is there a less scary block, like one with a cat?" Granny laughed. "As a matter of fact, there is. It's called Puss in the Corner." Granny found it and pointed it out to Lizzy. "And what about this one?" "It's called Moon over the Mountain." Lizzy could see exactly why it was called that. A large circle was partially covered by a triangle that pointed up, that looked like the peak of a mountain. "This is a honeybee block, and this one is called Old Maid's Puzzle." Lizzy giggled at that name, but couldn't make out anything that resembled an old maid or a puzzle. "Look at that one," Lizzy said excitedly. "It's a Scotty dog. McDoo, look at you." McDougal, who had been snoozing, wagged his tail and yawned. "I remember that block, Mom. That was when we had Toshi." "Who was Toshi?" asked Lizzy. "When I was your age, we had a Scotty named Toshi. Toshi was short for Macintosh. He was notorious for chasing the geese away from the pond outside. Remember that, Mom?" "Oh, Lord, yes. I remember. He would race after those geese and they would scatter to the four winds like marbles dropped on a dance floor. He then pranced back to the house as if he had just saved his castle from an invasion of winged water rats. Those poor geese." "I saw a goose at the pond earlier," said Lizzy. "You did?" queried Granny. "I did, and I told it to go find its family before the storm, and it just took off, like I said. I didn't have to chase it away or anything. He just understood what I said and flew away." "Well, now, I suppose that is one very smart goose. And do you know what?" "What?" said Lizzy. "There are geese in my quilt. Look at the border." Lizzy pulled the quilt closer and grabbed the edge. "These are called flying geese. They are triangles that chase after each other, all going in the same direction." She ran her hand around the different colored triangles in the border and easily understood why they were called flying geese. Granny pointed out other blocks: the double wedding ring, courthouse steps, trip around the world, snail's trail, and robbing Peter to pay Paul. She couldn't remember the names of all the blocks, but she had made a chart and kept notes. They were in an envelope that was labeled "My Sampler Quilt, 1930. The envelope stayed in the cedar chest, but Lizzy hadn't seen it, because she had not bothered to look at any documents or letters. The quilt sparked Lizzie's imagination with curiosity and wonderment. She worried about Peter getting robbed. Who was it that needed to pay Paul? She imagined taking a trip around the world and wondered what it would be like to climb up the steps to the courthouse, and how intimidating it would be if she had to sit in the witness chair and have lawyers pressing her for answers to difficult questions. Granny asked, "Do you see how each block has a strip of fabric on the left side and another darker strip along the bottom?" The question brought Lizzie back to reality. "I do," said Lizzie. "When quilt blocks are sewn together like this, it's called an attic window setting. I saw nothing but a jumbled mess when I put my blocks side by side. But then I thought about trying the attic window, and it worked like magic." Lizzie stepped back and noticed that indeed it appeared that each quilt block had been placed inside of a window frame. It made her think about how every window on earth had a different view, and that outside every window was a world of possibilities. She studied the quilt quietly. She was in awe of Granny's accomplishment. In that moment, something changed inside of Lizzie. She was a bit wiser and a little bit more grown up. She had a newfound appreciation for her grandmother. She had always just accepted the fact that Granny was rich, and it really meant nothing to Lizzie. But now she realized that Granny was practical and very thankful for the things she had. It now made sense to Lizzie why Granny would volunteer for the Veterans Christmas dinner, and why she would go to such great lengths to put up a Christmas display that would bring happiness to someone who might not otherwise have such a joyful holiday. She also promised to herself that she would never again think of a quilt as being just a quilt. She now understood why Granny kept her most precious quilt in such a safe place. "Can I sleep under the quilt tonight, Granny?" Lizzie asked, barely able to contain her excitement over this new discovery. Granny and Mrs. Albright exchanged glances. "I suppose so, Elizabeth, but you must promise to be extra careful with it." Lizzie nodded in agreement. "I promise," she said, wondering how she could ever fall asleep after this much excitement. No amount of reindeer prancing on the roof could make her any more excited. After everything was put back in the cedar chest, Granny and Mrs. Albright carefully folded the quilt. They shut off the light and descended the attic stairs to Lizzie's room. Mrs. Albright spread the quilt over the bed while Lizzie ran to the bathroom to brush her teeth and change into her nightgown. She came back to her room and crawled under the covers. "Good night, sweetie, and happy birthday once more," Mrs. Albright said as she leaned over and kissed Lizzie on the forehead. "Sweet dreams, Elizabeth," Granny said as she turned out the light. The two left the room. The street lamps below were providing just enough light through the shears on the window for Lizzie to make out the patterns on the quilt. She quietly said the names of the blocks, touching each one gently. "Hello, Flying Geese. You'll be warm here for the winter," she said with a giggle. "Little Scotty dog, do you know McDougal? I'll introduce you. I think you will like him." She began to feel herself getting sleepy. She pulled the quilt up under her chin and closed her eyes. It wasn't long before the Sandman came.
I'm doing too much snuggly to talk. Okay, so I also love this chapter because it describes a lot of things that were very much a part of my childhood. My grandma did have a cedar chest up in the attic that was full of baubles and crystals and fancies, and I got to play dress up in them, and it was the highlight of my visiting her. And so it was essential to put this to me in the story because I think a lot of people had cedar chests. It was a very common thing for women that were older to have a cedar chest full of their hope chest, full of their china or their quilts, which I still also have many of my grandmother's quilts in that same cedar chest. And I just love this sampler quilt. It just has so many fun things in it. And I can't wait for this pattern to come out for everybody to see it because it's unlike any quilt I've ever seen. Maybe you've seen a lot of sampler quilts in your history of quilting, but I have not like this anyway,
Yeah.
that can really tell a story.
Well, I will. So that's a good tease because this chapter is all about the quilt. And of course, going through the story of the Great Depression and what Granny would have felt during that time, and how that we do use our creative energies sometimes to work through the difficulties of life. And you kind of got the attic started in the cedar chest and some of the stuff as we're going through it. But because I even go like 2 years ago, it's like when we're talking about the synopsis, you were saying, Ricky, I need to see the quilt. You need to design the quilt. I mean, and I did because this is all spun from the quilt. And it spins forward from the quilt, even though it's not a story about a quilt. So the quilt is still hidden as of today, as of giving you this vid pod, but the quilt will be revealed, and it has 42 blocks. It is a sampler quilt I don't want to say like anything you've never seen before, but it is pretty intense. And the fabrics that were described in this chapter are actually the fabrics that I designed for Benartex, so that people will be able to make the Lizzy Albright quilt with the fabrics that are described in the book. So that's kind of an exciting thing for me.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. I think all of our quilters are going to be very excited to see all these products.
Well, I can't wait to do the big reveal of the quilt. And now that we've got the quilt in the picture and Lizzy has taken a little nap, we're going to have a really fun follow-up chapter the next time we visit again.
In the picture.